So 3 goals, 3 points, and a perfect start to life in the Premier League as Tottenham Hotspur manager for Thomas Frank as Tottenham beat Burnley 3-0 on the opening day of the 25-26 Premier League season. Let's get straight into it. So going into this game, Thomas Frank made 3 changes from the team that snatched defeat from the jaws of victory against Paris Saint-Germain in the Super Cup. 3 changes: Archie Gray, Lucas Bergvall, and Brennan Johnson coming in for Kevin Danso, João Palhinha, and Rodrigo Bentancur. A lot of what we've heard about Thomas Frank really during his time in the Premier League, and certainly maybe their narratives have become louder since he's got the Tottenham job, is about how adaptable he is, not only just in terms of formations, but in terms of like game plans and really sort of getting them marginal gains, which we seem to completely ignore last year. And I thought it was interesting, bit of a brave call to go with Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall starting in midfield against a team like Burnley, who in previous iterations we've seen them under Sean Dyche, and they've really had that sort of gritty, nasty, you don't want to go there sort of appeal that I think Stoke had in the late 2000s, early 2010s under Tony Pulis, and then later a bit under Mark Hughes. But they coped really well with it, Archie Gray and Bergvall. Bergvall especially really looked like, of the three in that midfield of Sarr, Gray, and Bergvall, that he was really the one that was the more advanced. Obviously, with Maddison and Kulusevski out, there is a bit of a lack of a natural 10 there. I know Kudus can play there, but again, banged this drum before, why would you sign a player for 60 million and not put him in his best position? Obviously more to come on that later on in terms of Ebere Eze and his what looks like an imminent move to Tottenham. But back to the Burnley game, Bergvall really impressive again. I think in the pre-season he didn't look too sharp, and part of me was wondering how big an impact that injury that he suffered at the closing of last season, how much an impact that would have on him, just in terms of getting going and being a bit more sharp for this Premier League season. But he got really well. Within about 60 seconds, he nearly scored the opener, yet to get a Premier League goal. But I think if Saturday's anything to go by, I think that probably won't be a concern for him long term, because he really was getting forward, really pushing, looking to make something happen. And one thing I really liked about this is, I mentioned before about Burnley being a team which, you know, the sort of narrative around them has always been about them, you know, being brutes, big in the box, big defending crosses and that sort of thing. Obviously, there's been style changes. They've gone from Dyche to Company and then back to Parker, who's a bit more in that sort of remit. But I really enjoyed just how much of the time we're putting the ball in the box, because it feels like it's been a while since we've really just, you know, really just sort of tried scoring ugly goals. I feel like in a way sometimes we've been guilty of overplaying and trying to score the perfect goal, but they all count the same. So, and I think one man that definitely benefited from that was Richarlison, who opened scoring 10 minutes in. Lovely little play by Kudus. I think he initially lost the ball after we'd won it high up, and then forced Josh Cullen into a bit of an error, give the ball away, and then Kudus really with that sort of just a yard to get the ball onto where he wants it and to put that delivery in. We've seen Dembele. It's the same thing that I spoke about in the last podcast about these sorts of great players. They can maybe not be having a good game, but as soon as they get that little yard of space to deliver, that's when they punish you. And I feel like that's the difference that having someone like a Mo Kudus in the team is, in comparison to Brennan Johnson, who occupied the right for most of last year. And even Kulusevski, as good as Kulusevski, I think is. I don't think he's just got that sort of, you know, directness that someone like Mohamed Kudus has. That's not to say Kulusevski is not direct. I just think Kudus certainly a good player to have because he can punish you in more than one way. And I think us going more direct, Kudus putting them balls into the box, running at players really was key to that. And I think obviously we'll get on to Richarlison's second goal when it comes to it, but I really thought that that was quite an underrated finish. I think I heard somewhere, I don't know if it was Kudus or Thomas Frank, who said that they were speaking before the game about back threes often retreating a bit when they've got that extra man and they defend space rather than necessarily defending man to man. And it was quite interesting because Richarlison and I think Johnson, it might have been Johnson ahead of him, was sort of making the same arching movement where they're pulling away from goal to make that space. And then once they've got that angle, all they need to do is really just get a good connection and just guide it. And that's exactly what Richarlison did. Um, and then in terms of the first half, there were a load of clear cut chances. We were largely in control of the game. Um, there was some, I think Burnley had about a 10-minute spell where they looked like they maybe might punish us a little bit. But then the only other talking point really was Porro and that little nudge on Anthony. And it's one of them, if that was given, I don't think you'd have too much to say in terms of the logic of why the ref would give it, even though I don't think it's a penalty. But I can certainly see why Burnley, why they'd be a bit outraged about that, especially with I think the common consensus outside the top six that there is this, you know, big six bias, and that would feed into it. But moving on to the second half again, Burnley on the back foot for the first few minutes of the first half, and then they grew into the game a little bit. They actually had a really good chance with Jaden Anthony, who put it straight at Vicario. And I hope that that's maybe just a bit of a hangover from Ange from last year, and that can be eradicated. Just sort of letting teams back into the game. But we seem to manage it well from that. It's almost like that was a sort of wake up call, and we'd just decided to be proactive instead of reactive. And then second goal, Mohamed Kudus, again, really instrumental down that right hand side. I think this was the goal which every single player on the pitch touched, which was really quite promising, really showing that Thomas Frank's capable of playing this really, expansive football at times, which a lot of people have said about because of how pragmatic he's been at Brentford, that this wouldn't really be a thing. But I think by all accounts, Saturday was a good example of that. And in particular, this goal. I think there's a clip of Jamie Carragher talking about it on Monday Night Football, and he said about it really shows the sort of marginal gains that Frank's looking for. Little things like in possession when Vicario would have the ball and the centre backs would split, which was quite a key factor in this goal. But when it comes to this goal, the real talking point is Richarlison, who had a fantastic game. And this goal really was him at his best. And I feel like it's a sign of Richarlison, which we've seen glimpses of, but not enough since he's joined Tottenham, now in his fourth season. And what a goal. That I really hope that he can stay fit this year, because he's a player that as a fan you just really want him to do well. I feel like he sort of gets what it's like to be Tottenham. Might not be the most talented player in the squad by any means, but all game he was just really dominant. I think it was Maxime Esteve who in the first half, there's a couple of times where he dropped deep and he'd sort of get Esteve, entice him in enough so that he'd be committed, and then just sort of that back arm, just push him back a little bit, get that space and pop it off. And it happened time and time again. Ever since we've signed Richarlison, I feel like we've not really played to his strengths, which is probably why we've not seen the best out of him in a Spurs shirt. Obviously, there's a rough with his moves. His injury problems are also contributing to us not seeing the best out of him so far. But what I will say is when we signed him, it was quite evident he wasn't going to displace Kane. So then you're thinking, okay, well, where is Richarlison going to play? He's played on the left before at Watford. He's played sort of down the middle at Everton. is Conte going to change formation? And that become abundantly clear. No, it wasn't. So a lot of Richarlison's minutes were either coming on for Kane when, if Kane ever was subbed, or being deployed on that left hand side where he can play there. But again, I said it before, I said it again, play players in the positions that they are best in. I don't think that's a bold take. And then with Ange, straight after that, you're thinking of the strikers and what they do in them sorts of teams, and quite often they'd drop deep, sort of be the sacrificial lamb in the attack. We've seen it with Son in his first season. Whenever he played down the middle, obviously there's games where it did work, like when he scored a hat trick against Burnley. But under Ange, we never really put these balls into the box and play to Richarlison's strengths, who's, by all accounts, an absolute freak in the air, really, really good in the air, uh, can get a lot of shots away. And I feel like if he can stay fit, and it's a big if he can stay fit and we can play to his strengths, I really think he could come out of this season with a totally different perception. Obviously, we'll see Frank rotate. Whether or not Richarlison's in the starting 11 on Saturday remains to be seen. Solanke might be the option that you want to deploy, and that's entirely down to Thomas Frank. And it's nice knowing that these constant patterns that will come up like they did last season, that there'll be someone addressing it and sort of keeping our cards close to our chest and never really showing our hands. And I think if we can do that, I think we're going to be really, really good. Moving on to the third goal, Brennan Johnson, again, Richarlison involved. Perhaps I want to give a shout out to, because I've not watched loads of preseason. I went to the Reading game, I watched a Newcastle game, but that was pretty much it. And from those two games, Sarr was the one that I noticed. Really, really good at just winning the ball back, covering ground, and actually playing balls into the final third. I don't think he's actually that bad at. And he won the ball back high again, played in Brennan Johnson, who had a Brennan Johnson game, really. Wasn't too involved, but whenever he was in front of goal, he couldn't be questioned. And I think that's something we're probably going to learn to know with Johnson, that is his, standout attributes that we want to play to. But also, he, when he come to the club, he said he was a player which wanted to make the step up and become a big player for a big club. And as good as it is scoring these goals, if the goals aren't there, then there leaves a lot to be desired. But one thing I will say about Brennan Johnson is I noticed that he's trying a little bit more in pre-season. The Newcastle game, there's a couple of times where he dropped back into own half and sort of try and hit that crossfield switch to Matisse Tell or Son or whoever it may have been. And there was a moment in the first half where the ball was played over and Walker was sort of shepherding it out like he has done for decades and done effectively for decades. And Brennan Johnson really was battling with him to get across and really wrestling to, just get hold of the ball, just keep the ball for Spurs. And he eventually got it and then just played a 5-yard pass. And it's not a really significant part of the game. But if I just go back to last season and the opening game where there's one where he tackled, I think it was Christensen from Leicester. And when he got the ball, he had about 20 yards of space where he could have gone ahead. And then he just stopped and turned back in to play the easy ball and was tackled. And it was almost, an indictment of where Brennan Johnson was then. Obviously, since then, he's wrote himself into Spurs history, scoring the Europa League winning goal, 18 goals in the league. And I'm hoping that if Frank specialises in these marginal gains, I don't feel like there's loads that is completely unachievable areas of his game where he could improve. So I really, really hope that, Frank's sort of, he's a manager to get that out of him. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes. And obviously, rumours about Savinho today have gone a bit quiet. So, a goal on his first start of the season won't do Brennan Johnson's chances any harm when it comes to nailing down that left wing position. And then finally from the game, Mo Kudus. This guy is going to be an absolute star. He really is. Sometimes you can get, these sorts of players with all the ability in the world and, they let it get to the head and you don't see the best of them. I think the most clear example of that, I suppose, was Ndombele. I don't think anyone questioned his ability. You had the likes of Harry Kane, Gareth Bale coming out saying that he was one of the best, footballers they've ever seen. And it never got that with Spurs. That could be down to a number of different factors, but with Mohamed Kudus, it really feels like mentioned it before with Johnson saying about he wants to become a big player at a big club. And I feel like Kudus has got that, and I feel like he can back it up already against PSG, having to play that sort of secondary striker role, real ugly role, not what you want you know, when you're making your debut for the club and you want to impress, especially coming from a rival team. But he's done that superbly well. And I think when he come off against PSG, we lost a lot in terms of defensive output, just being able to hold the ball up to go alongside the flair and the skills that we all know he's got. And obviously we've seen that lovely touch, which was sort of the cherry on the icing of a very nice cake on the open day of the season for Spurs. Obviously, he got 2 assists. There was one where Richarlison got the ball off of Archie Gray, and he could have squared it to Kudus, who's probably screaming at him for it, but didn't. But I just think he's going to be so, so good. If we can keep him fit, he's going to be such a crucial player for us. And I feel like it's one which, if he carries on like this very, very quickly, um, those outside of Tottenham and sort of the rest of the Premier League are going to see this kid and think, wow, he's going to be the next star. So I really think he's that good. In terms of other players, Archie Gray, he's not normally played loads of minutes in midfield, but a rare midfield start for him, hoping that's an omen, which I think it will be. Thomas Frank wanted him at Brentford. Obviously didn't get him because he come to Spurs, so I don't doubt that he'll have a plan for him. And it's a weird one because we've not really seen a lot of Gray in midfield. So I think when, before this pre-season and the idea of Frank, a lot of us maybe would have thought that he'd be the type that would just sit in front of that back four, play them simple 5-10 yard passes, really just, a bit press resistant and, not really move from the area. But an underrated aspect, I noticed it in the Newcastle game, which the pre-season friendly, which I think was the best game he's played for us. His ball carrying's really, really good. It's a lot better than I thought it would be. That Richarlison chance I mentioned, where I think it was a combination of Dubravka and Steph kept it out. Archie Gray, there was the ball coming to him, and first time you're thinking, right, play that first time, along the ball, simple ball. And then he had a slight moment of hesitation, and you thought, come on, that's sort of the difference between knocking that ball straight away and just fizzing that in. But he had sort of a half second where he sort of took a touch to the right to sort of drag the defender in, shifted it back onto his left, and then just hit a lovely outside of the pass ball, just perfectly weighted through to Richarlison, who really could have easily got Gray a first Premier League assist. But overall, very, very promising. And then on top of that, you've got reports today that Ebere Eze is, really, really close to joining Tottenham. Whether, maybe that'll be a separate video because, I've still been stung by Morgan Gibbs White this summer. So maybe we'll leave that, but just a little word on him, just briefly. If we can get that signing in, that is such a good signing. And I think it's probably, in terms of players being at peak age, ready to go, and a big statement, I think that's probably the biggest since Tongi and Ndombele. Obviously, we know that didn't work out. And then previously before him, you're probably looking at Rafa van der Vaart. But Eze, wow, man, if we can get that done, that's gonna be so fun to watch. It really is. And I think look, there's reports that maybe it's Enix putting money in, maybe it's other investors, which we don't know about, which is sort of boosting our transfer revenue streams. But one thing that I think is apparent in the opening 2 games and even preseason is if you watch a player like Kudus, he quite clearly is an upgrade, and he adds something to the team, which you know is just that sort of X factor and that VI. That it sounds a bit wanky, but like just sort of like a star in the not a star in the making because I don't want to go overboard. Basically, he is just clearly an upgrade, and I don't get how we don't see these sorts of players and think, yeah, we could probably do with one more this window. We shouldn't settle for just one. Obviously, I know there's restrictions, but it sort of feels like Spurs have been operating with the handbrake on for quite a while. And as a Kudus, that's about 110 million, maybe even more combined. Plus, João Palhinha, a smart loan signing. I think I'll hold my hands up if it's that, just them three. Obviously you got Koto Takai and Teo and Danso made permanent, but if we walk away from this window and we can say, right, moving on from last year, we've got more defensive structure than we did, probably a bit more adults in the room tactically, and then we've got Mohamed Kudus on the right hand side, and now we've got Aberi Eze behind, and then you've got João Palhinha behind him. That's three signings which instantly upgrade your team and really changes the course of the season, and then the sort of trajectory that you can go on at the end of the season. Maybe that's what will push you further on if you're chasing top four or if you're in the cup competitions and you need that bit of spark. But I'll wait and see if it happens. I think it's going to happen, but overall, really positive. Really positive coming out of this. And actually, one final thing is, I know there was a change for Tottenham protest this Saturday. I know there's been a lot of people who've been saying, the transfer window's not shut. That's why it's first game of the season, new manager, you shouldn't be doing this. And look, I think they're valid points, but I think one thing which I spoke to Billy recently for an upcoming project, and one thing we've changed for Tottenham is the messaging needs to be consistent. And I think it's the first group really that I can remember which have organized protests, which have, really been stark in terms of numbers. And these protests aren't easy to make. And I don't think anyone who believes in anything and is shot down because of the people that won't join them, I don't think they should be, dragged over the coals for that. And I think Change for Tottenham have done it in a very respectful way. They've, clearly had good communication with those sort of people which might be connected with the club. And I think the main thing is that these sorts of protests, they lose validation if, as soon as things start going well, people crumble, because then I think the message gets lost. And I think, yes, look, ideally, you don't want a protest the first game of the season, but ideally, you don't want the issues that we faced at Tottenham with the hierarchy, which have probably turned some fans away for a while. I know my brother hasn't gone to a game in years because he's saying that he won't go again until Enoch go. So I'll only have positive things to say about them from what I've seen so far. But yeah, hopefully there is change coming in terms of the fortunes of Spurs, because if the opening weekend's anything to go by, we could see a different Tottenham this year, which I think is quite promising. And Man City coming up next, we've got results there before. Obviously, don't have Kulusevski, who seems to really turn it on there. But, we've got Thomas Frank, and we've got new formations, you know, new options. And hopefully we can see them deployed Saturday. And, let's see if we get a result. So until then, up the Spurs.